Everyone feared the billionaire's wife, until the new waitress does something no one expected. She made a young man cry right there in front of her as he lost his job before he could even understand what had gone wrong. And she smiled. For 10 long years, the wife of a tech billionaire instilled fear into the hearts of everyone who ever served her. No one dared to oppose her. No one even dared to try. Until one day, when a penniless waitress with nothing left to lose stumbled upon the darkest secret the woman had spent her entire life trying to bury. This is the true story of how an ordinary woman brought down a monster. Not with money, not with power, but with a single word. And I promise you, once you've heard this story, you will never look at the powerful in quite the same way again. In the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, there is a restaurant called Savannah Grill. But this is no ordinary restaurant. It is the kind of place where millionaire entrepreneurs book tables months in advance. The kind of place where politicians meet quietly behind thick oak doors under chandeliers that glimmer like frozen waterfalls. The air always carries the subtle scent of vintage wine and high society restraint. In a place where the price of a single steak could equal a full week's wage for a working man, a single name was enough to stop every server in their tracks. Linda Whitmore, wife of tech tycoon Brent Whitmore, whose software empire stretches from the coast of California to the shores of Florida. If his fortune could build skyscrapers, then Linda built something far more insidious, an invisible empire crafted entirely from fear. Every Friday evening, precisely at 8 o'clock, she arrived in a gleaming black Cadillac, always taking her seat at the corner table in the back, a spot that allowed her to watch over the entire restaurant. She dressed as if she were about to step onto the red carpet at a prestigious awards ceremony, and she never came without the readiness to destroy someone's life over the wrong glass of wine, a misplaced fork, or simply a glance that lingered too long. Everyone on staff knew that a night serving Linda Whitmore could make or break a career. Someone once lost their job because the napkin wasn't folded correctly. Someone else had to leave Charleston altogether after no other restaurant would hire them simply because she had called them filthy for suggesting an Italian wine. But the moment that haunted them all, the story that became a whispered warning passed down to every new employee, was the night of a young server named Tyler. He was just 20 years old, scraping together every penny for college that coming fall. That evening, while delivering an appetizer to the table next to hers, the cuff of his crisp white shirt passed too close to the edge of Linda's bread plate. He didn't touch the food, nothing was spilled, but Linda paused, set down her utensils, took a long breath, and said just 2 chilling words. "Excuse me." The entire restaurant fell into a silence, so sharp it felt like someone had dropped a crystal glass onto the floor. Tyler froze. Moments later, the manager appeared, his face pale, offering rapid apologies, bowing slightly, then signaling Tyler to leave immediately. No explanation, no second chance. Tyler quietly removed his apron, folded it, placed it on the table, and walked out with reddened eyes. And just as he crossed the door, while every eye in the room still followed him, Linda lifted her head and smiled, a cold, glacial curve of her lips like the first wind of winter. That was Linda Whitmore. That was how she operated, how she thrived, how she carved fear so deep into those who worked under her gaze that it lingered like an invisible scar. But what she didn't know was that in that hushed space, someone had seen everything. Someone who would never forget that smile. Her name was Grace Collins. And just a few weeks later, Linda Whitmore would wish she had never laid eyes on her. The story is only just beginning, and what you've heard so far is merely the tip of an iceberg, one buried deep beneath layers of secrets, power, and quiet defiance. If you've felt even a spark of intrigue and wish to follow the unexpected journey of Grace Collins, don't forget to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel, like and share this video to help spread its deeper message to others. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment below and let us know how far this story has traveled across the map and perhaps even into someone's heart. And now let us step together into the next chapter of the story. Linda Whitmore was not merely the wife of a tech billionaire. She was the embodiment of absolute power in a world where money decided who had the right to speak and who must bow their head. No one truly knew where she came from. All that was known was that more than 10 years ago, she arrived in Charleston and ascended to the heights of Southern high society with such ease, it was as if she had been born to reign. The local magazines hailed her as the epitome of elegance. Charity galas invited her to deliver keynote speeches. But behind the evening gowns, the pearl necklaces, and the carefully crafted words stood a woman whose very entrance could silence a room. And the most frightening part was that she knew it. Linda never needed to raise her voice. She never shouted. Her destruction came wrapped in stillness. A cold glance, a clipped judgment, the slight furrow of a brow that could make a manager apologize a dozen times over. Everyone knew that when Linda was displeased, someone would be leaving the restaurant, and those who witnessed it would carry that memory with them forever. Rumor had it that Linda once drove a veteran chef out of Charleston because his fish was slightly off in taste, that she made 3 phone calls to ensure a hostess who had botched a wine order would never be hired again in the city. These were not exaggerations. This was the reality inside the world Linda Whitmore ruled. She did not need to issue threats. Her very presence was enough to make even the strongest hesitate. Brent Whitmore, her husband, though one of the wealthiest men in the country, rarely spoke when beside her. It was said he had once been lively and magnetic, but since marrying Linda he had grown quiet, as if living behind the glass of a gilded cage. In photographs from charity events, he often stood behind her, his expression serene, but his eyes distant. At Savannah Grill, Linda always sat at the same table, table 9 tucked into the back corner where the light fell just right to create a soft, elegant glow. The staff referred to it as the throne. They memorized her habits as if preparing for an exam with no margin for error. Her water had to be spring water from the northern mountains served with no ice, and the lemon slice thin enough to see through. The bread basket must contain exactly 2 types of bread with no crumbs, and under no circumstances was the menu to be placed on the table before she was fully seated. Every detail was scrutinized because even the smallest mistake could unravel into a nightmare. Yet Linda never erupted in anger the way most imagine rage to look. She never slammed tables or shouted. She spoke softly, sometimes in tones barely above a whisper, but her words pierced the dignity of others like a needle through silk. And when someone walked away in tears, she remained seated, slowly sipping her wine as though nothing at all had happened. That is why within the restaurant, among those who had spent decades working in the service industry, the name Linda Whitmore was never spoken unless absolutely necessary. People referred to her only as her or the woman at table 9. New hires were warned from their very first day, do not look at her for too long. Do not speak to her unless she addresses you first. And above all, never explain or defend even the smallest mistake. With Linda, there was no room for pity, no tolerance for imperfection. She didn't just want to be served. She wanted to be worshipped, and everyone who worked at Savannah Grill understood that all too well. But what they didn't know was that among the silent crowd there was someone who had begun to watch her differently. Not with fear, but with curiosity. Not to please her, but to understand her. That someone was Grace Collins, and the calm way she had looked on the night Linda made Tyler cry had not gone unnoticed. Linda may not have known her name that evening, but she sensed something that didn't match the others. And she was right. Grace was unlike anyone who had ever served her before. And that would become the greatest mistake Linda ever made. Grace Collins had not been born to wait tables. She had once been an investigative journalist working for one of the largest newspapers in New York. By the age of 25, she had built a name for herself by digging into stories no one else dared to touch. Her reporting had led to local officials resigning, forced corporations to change their practices, and once even shut down a prestigious charity foundation after she uncovered a trail of suspicious expenditures. Grace was never wealthy, but she took pride in her work and the truth she delivered to her readers. She had always believed that if something was wrong, it was her responsibility to find it and bring it into the light. But then everything collapsed. The paper where she worked underwent a massive restructuring. Departments that didn't directly generate revenue were eliminated. Grace's investigative unit was one of the first to go. Her editor told her they were sorry that she had talent, but the times had changed. She was handed a small severance check and a polite wish for good luck. A few weeks later, the rent on her apartment was raised. Her longtime boyfriend moved out after a heated argument that never really had a beginning or an end, and her bank account was left with just enough to buy a train ticket back home to the south. Charleston was the city where she had grown up, raised by her aunt after her mother passed away. It was a place of cobblestone streets, sweeping oak trees, and memories she had once tried to leave behind in pursuit of a career in New York. But now there was no other choice. She returned with nothing more than a suitcase of clothes, an old laptop, and a heavy sense of failure that clung to her like humidity in the southern air. Her Aunt Lillian was a frugal and no-nonsense woman. She didn't ask many questions. She simply told Grace she could stay as long as she needed, so long as she helped with the yard and washed dishes after dinner. Grace began sending out job applications anywhere that would take them, but no one was eager to hire a former investigative journalist in a job market already crowded with desperation. One day, walking past Savannah Grill, she noticed a small hiring sign tucked behind the glass. She stepped inside and handed over her resume. The manager gave it a quick glance, frowned at the lack of relevant experience, then sighed and said they were short on help for the evening shifts, especially weekends. Was she willing to learn quickly and handle pressure? Grace needed the money. She nodded. The first days at Savannah Grill were a shock to her system. She had once believed she understood how the world worked, but standing in a sweltering kitchen, learning to carry trays without dropping them, memorizing dozens of precise and often unreasonable demands from wealthy patrons, she realized this was a battlefield of a different kind. Gone were the editorial meetings, the clatter of keyboards, the rush of phone interviews. In their place was the clinking of glasses, the rich aroma of food, and the bone-deep exhaustion that settled in after every shift. But what disturbed Grace most wasn't the work itself. It was the way some customers treated the staff, as if the servers weren't people at all. She saw a middle-aged man call a young waitress stupid because she brought the wrong dessert. A well-dressed woman flung her napkin to the ground when her food didn't arrive fast enough. And then there was Linda Whitmore, whose mere presence seemed to drop the temperature of the entire room. Grace didn't know what kept her coming back. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the lingering sting of failure in New York that made her grit her teeth and endure it. But deep inside her, that part of her that had once burned for truth, for justice, for what was right, had never fully gone out. And now it was flickering to life again every time she watched Linda Whitmore manipulate a room with a tilt of her chin or a flick of her eyes. Grace didn't yet know what she was looking for, but she felt with growing certainty that something wasn't right. And for the first time in months, she began to take notes again. Little details, quiet observations. She couldn't stop herself from analyzing, connecting, asking questions, because a part of her had never stopped chasing the truth, even if now she held a tray of water instead of a tape recorder. Grace had begun to adapt to the fast, high-pressure rhythm of Savannah Grill, moving with the practiced urgency of someone learning to survive rather than simply work. But there was still one thing she couldn't fully understand. Why were people so afraid of Linda Whitmore? Not the kind of fear born of respect, but something deeper, more primal. The kind of fear people feel in the face of a storm or a lightning strike, a survival instinct. She saw it in her coworkers' eyes every Friday evening when that familiar black car pulled up in front of the restaurant. Backs straightened, voices lowered, hands trembled slightly as they carried trays of water. And though Grace had not yet been on the receiving end of Linda's fury, she could feel the tension ripple through the room the moment the woman walked in. One late evening after their shift, while most of the staff were already changing and gathering their things to go home, Grace remained at the bar, polishing glassware beside an older employee named Eddie Morales. He was Puerto Rican, had worked at Savannah Grill for more than 15 years. His hair had grayed with time, his hands darkened and worn from labor, but his eyes still sparkled when he told stories. He was the only person in the restaurant Grace felt she could speak to honestly. That night when she asked him about Linda, he hesitated for a moment, then set the glass he was drying down on the counter. His voice dropped, became heavier. "Don't draw her attention. Don't make her notice you," Eddie said, looking Grace straight in the eye. There was no menace in his tone, only the weight of genuine warning. "I've seen good people, experienced people, young people with promise just like you, thrown out of here for nothing more than crossing her once." Grace frowned. "But she's just a customer. I mean, I get that she has a right to complain, but to the point where people are shaking just because she walks in." Eddie let out a soft laugh, but there was no warmth in it. "You think this is about food, about wine, about service? No. With Linda Whitmore, those are just the tools. She doesn't come here to eat. She comes here to remind every single one of us that she is the only person in the room with power." Grace fell silent, her fingers slowly twisting the cloth in her hands. Eddie continued, his gaze growing distant. "There was this one time a young server, very sharp, polite, one of the best we had, brought her the wrong wine. Just a simple mistake. He admitted it right away, apologized sincerely. But she didn't let it go. She didn't just demand that he be fired. She called 2 of the biggest restaurants in the area and made sure they wouldn't take him either. He had to leave Charleston altogether. Moved back in with his mother down in Alabama, and he was only 21 years old. A chill crept down Grace's spine. She still remembered the look in Tyler's eyes the night he was dismissed. But now, through Eddie's story, that memory sharpened as if it were no longer just a painful moment, but a single thread in a deliberate pattern. She used to be someone else, Eddie said softly, almost in a whisper. When she first came here, Linda was unsure of herself. She didn't know her French dishes couldn't pronounce the names of Italian wines, but she learned quickly. And not long after, she began acting like the rest of us were beneath her. Not because we'd done anything wrong, but because she needed us to be afraid. That's how she keeps control. Grace looked at him, her eyes steady. Then why do you still stay after everything? Eddie gave a sad smile. Because I've got a daughter who's about to start college. Because I know how to survive in this world. And because I know that if I leave, there won't be anyone left to tell people like you the truth. That night, as Grace walked home beneath the Charleston sky, Eddie's words echoed in her mind. Don't draw her attention. But unlike the others, Grace didn't feel fear. Instead, something stirred in her chest. Maybe it was a sense of justice. Maybe it was the stubborn reflex of a journalist who had never quite died. Or maybe it was the quiet, relentless need to understand why a woman would need to be so cruel just to feel alive. And in that moment, Grace knew she couldn't turn away from what she had seen. She didn't say it aloud, but somewhere inside, she had begun writing a silent memo. A story still formless, but growing with every day she spent under the same roof as Linda Whitmore. The first time Grace witnessed Linda strike, she hadn't thought the memory would stay with her. But it did. It returned every time she closed her eyes. It was a Friday evening, and the restaurant was packed. The chandeliers above shimmered like strings of tiny stars, and candlelight flickered off wine glasses, casting a warm, elegant glow. Grace was working the section near table 9 when the tall glass doors opened. A hush spread through the room. Linda entered, followed by her ever-silent husband, Brent Whitmore. They needed no announcement, no glance in their direction. The entire space seemed to hold its breath as she made her way to her seat. Grace stepped back behind the bar to watch from a distance. Linda wore a champagne-colored dress, classic in its cut but refined in its tailoring. A thin diamond bracelet caught the light on her wrist, and her sharp eyes scanned the room like a scanner in a security checkpoint. The server assigned to table 9 that night was Daniel, a young man who had been working at Savannah Grill for just over a month. He was enthusiastic, punctual, always striving to do everything right. Grace had spoken with him a few times, impressed by his politeness and his hunger to learn. He dreamed of opening a small restaurant of his own one day, and his time at Savannah Grill was meant to build experience. Every dollar he saved set aside for culinary school. Daniel brought the appetizer to the table just beside Linda's. As he leaned forward to gently place the plate, the crisp white sleeve of his uniform brushed ever so slightly past the edge of Linda's bread plate. He didn't touch it. It was a mere passing movement, gone in a blink. But as if she had been waiting for that very moment, Linda set down her knife and fork. She didn't shout. She didn't scowl. She simply turned and said, "Excuse me." 2 simple words, but from her lips they fell like a blade of ice. Daniel froze, the color draining from his face. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Your sleeve passed over my bread plate," she said, calm but loud enough for every nearby table to hear. "My food has been contaminated. I no longer have an appetite for it. I want another dish." She nudged the plate aside with the back of her manicured fingers, as if it were refuse. The restaurant manager appeared almost instantly. He bowed slightly, apologizing over and over, sweat glistening on his brow. Daniel tried to speak, to explain, but the manager's look silenced him before a word could form. Moments later, Daniel stepped away from the table and disappeared through the kitchen doors. He didn't return that evening. Grace watched it all from a distance, gripping her tray so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. She knew this wasn't about hygiene or food. It was a performance, a public execution. Linda hadn't just wanted another dish. She wanted everyone to see that she could destroy someone in minutes without ever raising her voice, without ever making a scene, just with her words and her gaze. What made Grace shiver wasn't the act itself, but the faint flicker of satisfaction at the corner of Linda's mouth when Daniel vanished behind the kitchen doors. It lasted only a heartbeat, but Grace saw it clearly. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't anger. It was pleasure. A twisted, calculated pleasure in exerting control. For the rest of the evening, Linda dined as if nothing had happened. She chatted lightly with her husband, sipped her wine, occasionally offered a comment on the dish or the lighting in the room. Brent nodded along his face, weary, the face of a man who had long grown used to witnessing such scenes. Grace was assigned to another section, but her eyes kept returning to table 9. When Linda finally rose to leave, her steps slow and regal, she cast a glance in Grace's direction. It was unclear whether it was a passing look or a subtle measure, but Grace felt something shift, as if Linda had sensed for the first time that someone in the room wasn't bowing. That night, Grace didn't speak to anyone. She went home and sat alone in the dark, her mind looping through the same images again and again. But what stirred inside her wasn't simple anger. It was something deeper, something that settled low and slow, like embers refusing to go out. It was the old instinct, the one she knew well from her years chasing the powerful and the polished, the ones who wore masks more expertly than faces. She didn't know what Linda Whitmore was hiding, but she was sure of one thing. No one behaves like that if they're truly secure in who they are. No one needs to crush others unless they're trying to cover something up. And from that moment, Grace made a decision. She would find out the truth. Not to get revenge, but to understand how someone becomes a monster. And if she could uncover that answer, maybe, just maybe, that monster would never have power again. A week after the night Linda Whitmore made Daniel vanish from Savannah Grill, the atmosphere inside the restaurant still hadn't returned to normal. The servers whispered in the corners after every shift, each one quietly avoiding the orbit of table 9 like it was an invisible electric chair. People wondered when Linda would return and who would be next to step onto her silent execution stage. Grace, meanwhile, watched in silence. She didn't speak about what she'd seen, but her eyes had sharpened. She was beginning to understand that Linda wasn't just a difficult woman. She was someone who lived on power, who fed off the fear she planted in others. And for someone like Grace, who had spent years tracking politicians and tycoons, this kind of behavior wasn't unfamiliar. What made Linda different was the way she wielded it, with silence, with precision, with the elegance of a chess master who never needed to touch the board to win the game. That evening, the restaurant was busier than usual. Maybe it was the end-of-month rush, or perhaps some unofficial gathering was drawing more patrons than normal. The floor manager, Mr. Peaton, was darting from table to table with the reservation list clutched in his hand, a nervous sheen on his forehead. Grace had just finished serving entrees near the bar when she heard her name called from behind. She turned and saw Mr. Peaton standing in the staff area, his eyes scanning her with rapid calculation. "Collins," he said in a low voice, "table 9 needs a new server tonight. Walker's out sick. I need someone calm, professional, steady under pressure. Can you handle it?" Grace paused just for the length of a breath. She looked into Mr. Peaton's eyes and saw clearly that he knew exactly what he was asking. Linda Whitmore hadn't returned since Daniel's dismissal, but everyone knew she would, sooner or later. And if it happened tonight, it would be Grace facing her. "I can handle it," she said, her voice steadier than even she expected. Mr. Peaton nodded and turned quickly back to his duties. As he walked away, Eddie stepped in beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. He didn't say much, just shook his head slowly, a quiet warning without words. Grace offered him a small, calm smile, then headed into the prep room. She spent nearly 15 minutes reviewing every detail from Linda Whitmore's service file. Spring water, no ice with a lemon slice thinner than a millimeter. Bread must be sourdough but without a hard crust. The napkin folded into a triangle, always angled toward the right hand. Wine was never to be suggested unless requested. No prolonged eye contact. No conversation unless directly addressed. She memorized each rule the way an attorney might prepare for cross-examination. This wasn't just a dinner service. It was a trial. And Grace Collins was ready to take the stand. At exactly 8 o'clock, the familiar black Cadillac pulled up in front of the restaurant, and for a single shared moment, everything inside came to a quiet pause. The door opened. Linda stepped out as if she were stepping onto a stage. Her turquoise silk gown hugged every curve with calculated grace. Her hair was swept into a sleek chignon, and her heels shimmered under the glow of the streetlights. Beside her walked Brent Whitmore, upright in posture, but with eyes dulled by years of fatigue. Inside, Grace stood just beyond the partition that separated the main floor from the staff corridor, watching through a narrow gap in the door. She drew a slow, steady breath, anchoring her heartbeat in place, then stepped into the light just as Linda approached table 9. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. My name is Grace. I'll be serving you this evening." Linda glanced at her, her eyes skimming across Grace like a scanner. She said nothing, only tilted her head slightly before taking her seat. Brent gave a faint nod. his lips pressed as if a thought had almost made it to the surface, but then quietly slipped away. Grace placed the menus on the table in a movement so smooth it didn't make a sound. She poured the water with exact precision, the lemon slice floating perfectly centered in the glass. She understood that in Linda's eyes, this wasn't service, this was performance, and tonight Grace was determined not to miss a single beat. What she didn't yet know was that Linda too was watching, waiting for the smallest misstep, for the tiniest crack. Because for women like her, the act of breaking someone was never an accident. It was always a decision. And tonight, she had chosen Grace. What she didn't realize was that this time the chosen one had a plan of her own. Linda Whitmore didn't speak a word for the first 10 minutes after being seated. She turned the pages of the menu with the tips of her fingers, eyes occasionally drifting around the restaurant like a judge inspecting for flaws. Brent sat opposite her in familiar silence, a man who had long since learned to survive beside this woman by saying nothing at all. Grace stood at the perfect distance, present but unintrusive, maintaining impeccable posture. She spoke only when addressed. Each time she approached the table, she took a deep breath and measured every movement with care. Linda set the menu down without looking at her. Her voice was soft as a breeze but sharp as a razor. "I'll have the French onion soup." Grace nodded, made the note, and left the table. In the kitchen, she watched the chef prepare the dish herself. She let no one else touch the tray. When the soup was ready, she examined the rising steam. The golden cheese melted evenly across the surface, bubbling slightly at the edges over a crisp slice of toasted bread. She placed it on the tray, her steps steady and strong, as if she were carrying something sacred. When she reached the table, she lowered her head slightly and set the bowl before Linda with a precision that could be measured in millimeters. Linda stared at the soup for a long moment. She didn't touch the spoon, didn't say a word. Then slowly she lifted the spoon and dipped it gently into the bowl. But just before the spoon reached her lips, she stopped, lowered it again, eyes still fixed on the bowl as if studying a failed piece of art. Every motion deliberate. She turned the spoon slightly in her hand, then set it back on the table. Finally, she looked up and locked eyes with Grace. "Is there a problem in the kitchen tonight?" Her voice was just loud enough for the two nearby tables to hear. Grace kept her tone even. "No, ma'am, everything was prepared as usual." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me why this soup is cold. I made it very clear that I expect my soup to be hot. Do you think I'm joking?" Grace felt the silence radiate outward like ink spreading across a white cloth. Conversations halted. A few heads turned. She understood this wasn't a question. This was the test. The moment Linda had been constructing since she stepped out of the car. "I sincerely apologize if the soup isn't to your expectation," Grace said, her voice smooth and calm. "I'll bring you a new one immediately. Hotter." She stepped forward to remove the bowl, but Linda raised a hand and rested her perfectly polished fingers on the rim of the porcelain. "Don't bother." Her voice had hardened. "The moment has been ruined. Diners have a right to proper service, and tonight it's clear this place no longer holds itself to that standard." Brent lifted his glass of wine without a word, as if his wife's sharp comments had long since faded into the background hum of his life. Linda turned toward him, her voice cool, her gaze colder. "You see, Brent, this is why I always have to double-check everything. People don't take pride in their work anymore. This girl clearly has no idea what the correct temperature of French onion soup should be." Grace stayed composed. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, their curiosity and caution mingling in the quiet air. But more than anything, she felt that one gaze, the one that mattered. Linda was waiting for a stumble, for hesitation, for a crack in the mask, waiting for her to flinch or stammer out apologies. But Grace knew she couldn't give her that. "Thank you for your feedback. I'll inform the kitchen to make sure your next dish is prepared exactly to standard. I'm sorry the experience didn't meet your expectations." Each word came out of Grace's mouth with quiet clarity, neither rushed nor trembling. She reached for the soup bowl, lifted it smoothly, and turned away. In that moment, the restaurant melted into silence. She no longer heard the clinking of silverware, the muted conversations. Only the sound of her own footsteps on the tiled floor and the long, taut silence stretched like a wire behind her, connecting her to the woman who still sat watching. Inside the kitchen, the chef turned to her with visible frustration. "What is this? That soup just came out of the oven. I checked the temperature myself." "I know," Grace said softly, but that's not what she was angry about. She set the bowl on the counter and turned away, her chest heavy with a weight that felt both cold and crushing. And then it hit her. For the first time, she realized she had passed the opening round of a game she had never agreed to play. But she also understood something else. Linda Whitmore was now watching her, and in Linda's world, being seen was never a good thing. Grace returned to the dining floor with a face so calm it seemed carved from porcelain. No one could have guessed what was happening behind her quiet eyes, not even Grace herself. The soup that Linda had declared cold had still been steaming when Grace placed it on the kitchen counter. But she hadn't argued, hadn't defended. She'd seen enough to know this wasn't about food temperature. It was a psychological test, a deliberate trap. Linda hadn't come for a perfect dish. She had come for a reaction. She wanted fear. She wanted fluster. She wanted the cascade of apologies, the bowed head, the quiet collapse of dignity. But Grace had denied her all of it. For the rest of the evening, Grace carried out her duties with a level of precision that bordered on perfection. Every dish arrived in the correct order. Every wine glass was refilled to just the right level. Napkins were replaced at the exact moments they should be. Not a single guest in her section was overlooked and no detail went unaddressed. Linda Whitmore said nothing more, but her eyes betrayed a mounting frustration. Each time Grace passed by, Linda's gaze followed sharp and narrowed, as if trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together, as if wondering why this one didn't flinch the way the others always had. Brent, as usual, remained silent. He rarely spoke, choosing instead to nod or sigh gently as though conserving energy for a battle long since lost. But there was one brief moment, barely a flicker, when Grace placed a fresh glass of water before him, and he whispered, "Thank you," then glanced quickly at his wife as if checking whether she had noticed. That small, cautious gesture told Grace everything she needed to know. He was not a cold man. He was simply a man who had learned to survive by living quietly enough not to be swallowed whole. When the meal ended, Linda rose from her seat first. She didn't look at Grace, didn't offer a word. But as she turned to walk away, Grace felt the weight of her gaze linger like a hand pressing into her shoulder. A look that was neither fully challenging nor entirely curious, but something in between. Brent followed behind his wife, his steps steady, subdued. But just before he left the dining area, he paused beside Grace. Without meeting her eyes, he slipped a neatly folded bill into her hand. His voice was low, almost a breath. "I'm sorry, young lady?" Then he turned quickly, falling in step with the cold silhouette ahead. Grace didn't open the bill until she was alone in the staff locker room. A $100 note folded into precise quarters. No note, no name, just another kind of silence, a reward for courage, or an apology for something he couldn't control. She stared at it for a long time before tucking it into her pocket, not for its value, but for what it represented. That night when the restaurant closed, no one said a word about the cold soup. No one mentioned the scene Linda Whitmore had orchestrated in front of a full dining room. But Grace knew they had all seen it, and more importantly, she knew Linda had seen it too. Seen that this time the prey didn't run. This time the server didn't break. Eddie caught her eye as they stepped out the back door into the cool night. He didn't say a word, just nodded slowly. But in that single gesture was both recognition and worry. Because Eddie knew better than anyone when Linda Whitmore couldn't break someone, she began to notice them in a different way. Grace walked home under the breeze of a quiet Charleston night. Her steps weren't hurried, but they weren't idle either. She didn't feel proud, didn't feel like she'd done something grand. She only knew that she had stayed true to herself. She hadn't served a powerful woman. She had simply refused to be controlled by her. And in a world where most people were used to bowing, that alone made her different. What she didn't know was that across the city, in a room walled in soft light and silence, Linda Whitmore sat before her vanity mirror, removing each earring with a deliberate hand, wiping the blood-red lipstick from her mouth with careful strokes. But her mind remained elsewhere. It lingered on the image of a young waitress who had dared to meet her gaze and not blink. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. But she was unsettled. And that was a feeling Linda wasn't accustomed to. Linda Whitmore feared no one. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt as though she had dropped something. Something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was her power. Maybe it was the perfect mask she had spent so long polishing. Or worse, maybe it was the absolute control she had always believed was hers. Grace didn't sleep that night. After returning from Savannah Grill, she sat at her small desk, the warm glow of her lamp spilling across a blank sheet of paper where she had begun to jot down notes. Every detail about Linda Whitmore was coming into focus like incomplete puzzle pieces finally being sorted. The flicker in her eyes when Grace didn't crumble. the way her fingers had rested lightly on the soup bowl, like a signature on a decree. And especially that final glance before she left the restaurant, cold but not at ease. Grace had seen that look before, not from customers, from people in power, the kind who knew they were being watched, the kind who had something to hide. In the world of investigative journalism, that look was never the ending. It was always where the story began. She opened her laptop, connected to the internet, and began searching. Full name, Linda Whitmore. Wife of Brent Whitmore, CEO of Whitcore Solutions, a tech conglomerate listed among the wealthiest businesses in the southeastern United States. Information about Brent flooded the Screen Company history, investment portfolios, interviews in financial magazines, even candid shots snapped by tabloids. But Linda was different. Articles about her focused solely on charity galas, fundraising dinners, and red carpet appearances at social events. No personal interviews, no details about her background. Every profile repeated the same sentence like a refrain. Linda Whitmore, formerly Linda Sterling, born into a wealthy family in Virginia. No mention of parents, no high school, no trace of a childhood. As if her life had only begun the moment she married Brent. Grace frowned. In elite circles, privacy wasn't unusual, but this level of blankness, this clean, unbroken white, was rare. With the instincts of someone who had once chased political cover-ups for a living, Grace knew this wasn't discretion. This was concealment. She kept digging using new search terms: Linda Sterling, Virginia, teenage years. The results were fog. No local news clips, no yearbook photos, no record that anyone by that name had ever existed before Charleston. She changed tactics. Instead of chasing the past, she began pulling from the present. She traced old articles about Brent and Linda's wedding. The ceremony had taken place in Charleston 12 years ago. A piece in a local wedding magazine described the bride as elegant, graceful, with refined taste and a traditional upbringing. But again, no names of relatives, no images of friends, no industry representatives. In one grainy photo from the reception, Linda smiled softly beside Brent. Her blonde hair swept up her face, delicate under heavy makeup. Grace zoomed in and froze on her eyes. In that split second, Linda wasn't looking at the camera. Her gaze was off to the side. And in that look, there was something that didn't match the flawless surface. Not fear, not anger, but calculation. Grace returned to an old habit from her reporting days. She opened a reverse image search program, uploaded the clearest portrait of Linda Whitmore she could find, and let the system scan for visual matches across archived databases. The early results were a flood of social articles, duplicate photos, empty links. But on page 13 of the search results, one link stood out. It led to an outdated website long since abandoned. The site belonged to a small modeling agency in Orlando, Florida. Grace clicked. The website was slow, clunky, its design frozen in time, but it loaded. In the model directory, surrounded by names she didn't recognize, Grace found an image that made her heart stop. A young woman, likely in her early 20s, stared back from the screen. Bleached blonde hair, heavy makeup, a tight denim jacket over a short-fitted dress. Her pose was bold, unapologetic. Her gaze locked straight into the camera, defiant, challenging. Beneath the image, a simple label, L. Mayfield. Grace zoomed in. The facial structure was unmistakable. It was Linda Whitmore, only younger, rougher, and utterly unrecognizable from the polished, composed socialite the world had come to know. Grace dropped into her chair, heart pounding. Suddenly, the pieces were falling into place. Linda Sterling had never existed, and if L. Mayfield was her real name, then everything Linda had built over the past decade was crafted on a fictional identity. Grace didn't yet know what kind of secret she had just touched, but she knew one thing with certainty. This was no longer about a waitress and her client. This was about a mask that was beginning to slip. And Grace Collins, once cast out of journalism, now stood at the edge of a truth that could unravel everything. She couldn't stop staring at the photo of L. Mayfield embedded in that dusty old modeling site. The more she looked, the more she saw. The same sharp chin, the same razor-edged eyes that had scanned her across table 9 just the night before. But the most striking difference wasn't in the face, it was in the energy. In the photo, the girl was trying far too hard to be noticed. Her makeup was too thick, her outfit too loud, her pose too forced. Every inch of her screamed for validation, screamed that she mattered. And Grace understood. She had seen it before, again and again in her investigations. People can fake anything, accent, posture, name, but the eyes never lie. Lisa Mayfield, That was the real name. There was no doubt now. Grace followed the thread deeper. She dug through old forums, combed through local entertainment archives from Florida, scanned every scrap of forgotten media. And then she found a short article from the early 2000s buried in the entertainment section of a Tampa community paper. It mentioned a young woman named Lisa Mayfield, who had taken second place in a regional amateur modeling competition. No one seemed to know where she had come from, but the piece noted she had clear ambition and an unflinching gaze. It was likely that same ambition that had propelled her beyond the small stages and cheap cameras, pushing her forward step by calculated step. Grace leaned back, the weight of what she'd uncovered beginning to settle in. Linda Whitmore wasn't just hiding a past, she had erased it. And now, as cracks began to form in the persona she had so carefully crafted, Grace realized this wasn't just the beginning of a story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. From an unknown model, Lisa took a chance on a small reality television show called Highway Hearts, a low-budget series that followed young women working promotional jobs at racing events across the southern states. Grace dug through forgotten fan forums, dusty corners of the internet no one had touched in years, and eventually uncovered a few low-resolution video clips, remnants of a show long since buried. And in one grainy, wind-blown episode, beneath the roar of engines and the hiss of wind across the mic, she heard it, the voice. A female voice, thick with a southern drawl, loud, fast, and locked in a shouting match with another girl about stolen lipstick and a borrowed jacket. Grace paused the video. There she was. Lisa. Her face, flushed eyes, blazing lips drawn tight with fury. There wasn't a trace of Linda Whitmore in that moment, but to Grace, that version, the raw, unguarded, messy version, was the truth. After the show, Lisa vanished from public view. No appearances, no mentions, no trace for at least 2 years. Grace guessed that Lisa had realized the road to fame built on spectacle wasn't going to take her where she wanted to go. She didn't want to be entertainment. She wanted power, respect, and to claim that she would need to erase her past. Lisa Mayfield had to die so that Linda Whitmore could be born. The transformation could not have been easy. Grace traced public records for legal name changes filed in the state of Georgia and found one faint, dusty document. A petition to change the name from Lisa Mayfield to Linda Sterling, filed the same year that Linda began appearing at events frequented by the business elite. The timing was perfect. The name Sterling carried polish class, a fabricated air of nobility. No more gritty southern past, no more brash roadside arguments, no more country twang. Linda Sterling was a lady, refined, educated, tasteful. And shortly after, she met Brent Whitmore at a fundraising gala in Atlanta. The story told in the press was a love-at-first-sight fairy tale, but Grace knew better. With someone like Linda, nothing was left to chance. It was a strategy, a deliberate, methodical plan. Lisa hadn't simply captured the heart of a tech mogul. She had targeted a man who could elevate her into an entirely new stratum of society. And she succeeded. But the cost was absolute. She had to bury every last remnant of her former self, to step into the Whitmore estate as if she had never existed before that moment. Grace could almost picture her Lisa standing before a mirror practicing vowel sounds, mimicking the clipped tones of old money accents, training herself to walk, to drink, to sit like she belonged in drawing rooms and boardrooms. A performance without intermission, one that had lasted over a decade. And somehow it had worked. Until now. Until a quiet waitress named Grace Collins began to watch, began to question. Not out of spite, not for revenge, but because of instinct. That unshakable pull inside her that whispered there was something brittle beneath the flawless surface. And when that surface began to crack, Grace couldn't look away. She knew she had found the artery of the snake. The only question left was what she would do with that secret, because this wasn't just the story of a woman who had reinvented herself. This was a story about power, about deception, and about those who would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect the mask they had built with their entire life. Grace didn't sleep at all that night. After discovering the truth about the name Lisa Mayfield and the long calculated path to becoming Linda Whitmore, she knew this wasn't the end. The truth was peeling back in layers, and beneath it, she could sense something else, something deeper, something that went beyond a false name. The grainy clips from Highway Hearts showed a Lisa who was impulsive, hot-headed, driven by raw instinct. But Grace needed more than that. She needed something uncut, undirected, uncontrolled, a glimpse behind the curtain that revealed the woman as she really was. A moment caught on camera when Linda wasn't in control of the performance. She returned to an old message board where fans of Highway Hearts once gathered, a forgotten corner of the internet, dusty and half-abandoned. For hours she combed through buried threads, ignored posts, digital fossils left by people who had long since moved on. Then, deep in the archives, she found it, a user called MegFan89, who years ago had posted a vague but intriguing message. "Anyone remember the meltdown Lisa had in the finale? I still have the original cut." Grace felt her pulse quicken. She messaged the account immediately, introducing herself as a media researcher working on a documentary about the early days of reality television. She didn't tell the truth, not all of it, partly because she feared the user wouldn't respond if they knew her real reason, but mostly because she understood she was stepping into something shadowed now, something dangerous. Yet within her, a voice was growing louder and clearer. If there was a video out there that showed Linda Whitmore coming undone on camera, not edited or cleaned up but real, then that video could be the final nail in the mask she'd built so carefully. And Grace needed that nail, not for revenge, but for truth. 3 days later, the message arrived, a single line clipped in casual with a Dropbox link attached. "This never aired. Got cut from the finale. Someone on the crew sent it to me back then. You didn't hear it from me." Grace barely blinked as she clicked the link. The screen opened to a familiar setting from the show, Highway Hearts, its cheap sun-bleached glory. A racetrack under blazing light, horns, loudspeakers, distant cheers bouncing off the asphalt. The camera panned across the line of young women in short dresses cued for the style competition. Then there she was, Lisa. At first, a tight smile as the host called her name, a glance to the side, a flicker of something brittle in her eyes. Then a jarring shift. The camera jolted, cutting abruptly to a shaky behind-the-scenes angle. Lisa was crying, no screaming at a makeup artist, her voice sharp, ragged. She shouted that the dress didn't fit, that she couldn't let that brunette girl win. She slammed her fist against the mirror, shoved the makeup table hard enough to send brushes clattering. A crew member stepped in, tried to calm her. She jerked away, swore at him, crude, cutting words, each one caught clearly by the mic. The voice was thick with her southern roots, furious, raw. There was no trace of Linda Whitmore. Only Lisa, unfiltered, exposed, terrified and unraveling. Grace sat frozen. In under 5 minutes, the carefully constructed mask had fallen away. This was it. The video was everything. A total breakdown captured on camera, the kind of footage any public figure would burn a lifetime to bury. And for Linda, who had spent more than a decade cultivating the image of a poised, untouchable woman of grace, it was nothing short of a nightmare come to life. She hadn't just lost her temper, she had come undone, and it was all there, unedited, undeniable. Grace downloaded the file immediately, saved it in 3 separate locations, encrypted the file name, then sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the screen. She didn't feel triumphant, no thrill, no rush of satisfaction, only stillness, a heavy, sobering quiet. She was holding power now, not the kind that Brent Whitmore had built on stocks and boardrooms, but the power of truth in a world addicted to lies. She remembered what her old editor once told her. One truth can save a life, or it can ruin an entire world. The question is what you choose to do with it. Linda Whitmore had lived for over a decade under a name that wasn't hers. She had used her influence to humiliate, control, and crush those who couldn't fight back. People had lost jobs, lost hope, simply because they stood in the path of the persona she was determined to protect. And all along it had been to keep this very footage buried. And now it was in the hands of someone who wasn't afraid of her. Grace Collins stared at the file name one last time. She knew that from this moment forward, there was no going back. That Friday night, a gentle rain fell over Charleston. Not heavy enough to soak the earth, but just enough to thicken the air inside Savannah Grill with dampness and unease. From the start, something about the evening felt off. Guests arrived later than usual. The kitchen worked in an unusual hush, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath, waiting for something they couldn't name. And then at exactly 8 o'clock, the front doors opened, and Linda Whitmore stepped inside. Alone. There was no Brent at her side, no hand to carry the expensive leather handbag, no soft laughter from the ever-polite husband, just Linda. Dressed in a sharp black suit, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to strain her scalp heels, clicking against the marble floor with the cold ring of metal. The room fell silent. Servers froze mid-step, dishes hovered mid-air. Every eye turned toward the woman whose presence everyone knew, but whose gaze no one dared to meet. Linda ignored them all. She walked directly to table 9, the seat that had for years been her throne. But tonight, no one followed. No one preceded her. It was only Linda sitting down, not for a meal, but as if preparing for a confrontation. From the beverage station, Grace watched everything. She didn't flinch, didn't rush forward. But she understood instantly this wasn't like the other nights. There was something in the way Linda carried herself, in the angle of her chin, in the way her eyes scanned the room. It wasn't arrogance this time. It was assessment, calculation. She was measuring, looking for the threat. And then her gaze settled on Grace. A single slight nod, no words, no excess gestures, but the command was clear. Mr. Peaton, the restaurant manager, came up beside Grace, speaking in a near whisper, as though afraid the walls might listen. "I'll send someone else. You don't have to go." But Grace shook her head. She knew this moment was inevitable. Whether she wanted it or not, she had already stepped onto the field. She wiped her hands on her apron, took a breath, and walked toward table 9. Linda looked up as she approached. No smile, no greeting. She tapped a single finger on the polished wood table, then gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit down. I'm still on shift, Mrs. Whitmore. If I sit, I could be fired." Linda tilted her head, a dry smile playing at her lips. "If you don't sit, I'll buy this place tomorrow morning and turn it into a parking lot. Your choice." Grace looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, she pulled out the chair and sat down. Resting her hands gently on her lap, her eyes steady, unflinching. The room around them seemed to fade. No one came near. No one dared. The air had thickened into glass. Linda leaned forward slightly, her voice low and composed. "I don't know who you are or what kind of game you think you're playing, but let me make this clear just once. I had my lawyers look into you. You were a journalist. You got fired. You're in debt. You live in a rundown apartment. You have nothing but a forgotten name and a past full of failure." Grace said nothing. She didn't deny. She didn't defend. She simply watched. Linda continued, her voice sharpening into steel. "If you so much as whisper what you think, you know I will make sure you never work in another restaurant in this entire state. I'll call every owner. I'll sue you until there's not a cent left in your account. I'll bury you in lawyers' lawsuits and rumors. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. No one dares cross me. Do you understand?" Grace looked at the woman across from her. There was no elegance left, no poise, only someone holding together something that was already crumbling. And then for the first time, Grace saw it. Fear. Not in the words, but in the eyes, in the way Linda's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, in the way she avoided Grace's gaze when she delivered her final line. Linda Whitmore sat there, but Grace could see it now. Lisa Mayfield was trembling behind the mask. The woman across from her was still sitting, straight hands pressed lightly against the polished surface of the table like she was preparing to sign $1 million deal, but her eyes were faltering. Beneath the long silence lay a quiet panic, something boiling just under the surface. Grace sat still, watching, measuring. Each blink, each breath, each forced swallow from the most powerful woman she had ever met. The entire restaurant had fallen into a hush so complete it felt suspended. The occasional clink of silverware in the distance was all that remained of normalcy. Staff and diners pretended not to notice, but everyone was watching, quietly, uneasily. One woman, long regarded as a symbol of intimidation, the other a name not yet etched into the fabric of the place, but one who now sat calmly across from the storm. Linda suddenly leaned back, crossing her arms. Lips pressed tightly as if restraining herself. Then, in a voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear, she tilted her head and said, "You have no idea who you're playing with. I could buy this entire place with one phone call." Her words sliced through the air, calculated sharp, a threat dressed in ice. Grace didn't flinch. She placed her hands gently on the edge of the table, leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Linda's. "And if you did, would you shut it down? Fire every employee, destroy the lives of people who've done nothing wrong just because I wouldn't bow to you." Linda's brow lifted, a smirk curling her mouth, but beneath it something flickered. She didn't answer at first. "Then I've done it before, little girl. I don't threaten. I act. You think you're special. You're just another forgettable name in a long list of people who've ruined my mood. I don't need a reason to ruin you." Grace's voice was calm, steady, but this time it carried something new. "You do this time because I have something you're afraid of, a past you've buried so deep even you've tried to forget it. The name Lisa Mayfield may have been wiped from your paperwork, but not from cameras, not from the internet, and not from the memory of people who remember exactly who you used to be." Linda froze, just for a second, but long enough. It was enough. She placed her hands on the table, leaning in, voice dropping to a hiss that barely slipped through her clenched teeth. Are you blackmailing me? Grace shook her head. I don't want your money. I don't want revenge. I just want you to stop. Stop using your fear as a weapon to hurt people. Stop hiding behind power just to feel safe. You don't need to make people afraid to be worth something. Linda laughed, a dry, hollow sound like a glass about to crack. You think you know. Me, a water-carrying little girl, thinks she has the right to lecture? Me? Grace didn't move. She just looked at her. With clarity. With the kind of silence that doesn't need to argue. The kind of silence that comes from knowing the truth and not needing to prove it. Grace rose to her feet, her movement gentle, the chair sliding back with the soft deliberation of someone preparing to leave. She leaned in slightly, speaking just loud enough for Linda to hear, no louder. I don't think I understand you, but I know the truth when I see it, and I know the truth can end a reign if it's told at the right moment. Linda shot up the force of her movement, sending the chair screeching harshly across the floor. Several guests turned their heads, startled. Her fists clenched, her eyes wide with fury, her face twisted in a strained effort to hold herself together. You dare to challenge me? You're signing your own death sentence. Grace remained calm. This isn't a challenge. It's a reminder that any crown can fall if it's worn the wrong way, and people aren't afraid of you anymore. Linda stared at her unblinking, then said nothing. She grabbed her handbag, adjusted her blazer, and turned to walk away, leaving behind a room wrapped in an unnatural silence. But this time, no one looked away. Every eye followed her, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. No one could quite grasp that the woman who had once made staff tremble with the sound of her heels entering the restaurant could be confronted like this, and least of all by a young waitress who had only joined them less than 3 months ago. Grace sat back down a moment later, quietly taking in the room. Mr. Peaton began making his way toward her, worry clouding his expression. But Grace offered only a small smile, a soft curl of her lips, light as a breeze brushing the surface of a lake. She knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time in many years, the power that Linda Whitmore wielded had been shaken. And Linda knew it too. Linda Whitmore walked away with quick, tight strides, the click of her high heels striking the stone floor like the rhythm of a drum, signaling the end of a reign. The door of the Savannah Grill closed behind her, and with it came a heavy hush that settled over those who had once trembled at the sight of her. But this silence was no longer rooted in fear. It was astonishment. Those who had witnessed the moment had never seen Linda lose. They had never seen her challenged, much less forced into retreat by a young woman in a waitress's uniform. And in their minds, a question began to form. Who was Linda really? And what kind of person was Grace to dare stand up to her? Grace knew the fight had only just begun. Linda wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat quietly, especially not from someone she had dismissed so completely. But Grace wasn't waiting for her to strike back. She was ready. The truth was the only weapon she needed, and she already had it. That night after her shift, Grace returned to her small apartment with its worn-out roof and patchy paint on the walls. She turned on her computer and logged into the email account she had used to reach Beth Collins, the old friend of Lisa Mayfield from years ago. Beth had sent another video file. Grace opened it in the dark, the screen casting pale light across her face, reflecting a blend of resolve and sorrow. The video was raw, behind-the-scenes footage never aired from an old reality television show. In it, Lisa Mayfield, with bleached blonde hair and heavy makeup, was crying, shouting, throwing a plastic crown to the floor. She screamed bitter accusations at the judges, at the other contestants, and at herself. The poised, cold-voiced woman was gone. There was no trace of elegance or control. Just a young woman unraveling in desperation, furious at rejection, aching from the need for validation, terrified she might never become anyone at all. Grace didn't watch with mockery. On the contrary, she felt a vague, aching pity for that woman. In some deep, wordless way, she understood the pain that Linda, or more truthfully, Lisa had carried. But sympathy could not excuse the harm she had inflicted on others. The next day, Grace walked into the restaurant as she always did. No one said a word, but the way they looked at her had changed. There was admiration in their eyes, and caution, and something softer too. She didn't need praise. The only thing she had ever wanted was change, and change she knew begins with the truth. Mid-shift. Just as the restaurant began to fill with the usual lunch crowd, a small parcel arrived at the front desk. There was no sender listed, only a single line written across the envelope, for the manager of Savannah Grill. Mr. Peaton accepted the package with a curious glance, opened it, and found inside a USB drive along with a short handwritten note. He skimmed the letter, then turned abruptly and disappeared into the back office, closing the door firmly behind him. 15 minutes later, he emerged, his face pale, the color drained as if he had seen something he could never unsee. He scanned the room slowly, his eyes landing on Grace as she tended to a table near the window. He didn't speak. He simply gave her a slight nod. But that small gesture carried more than gratitude. It was recognition. Grace knew he had watched the video. He had seen who Linda Whitmore truly was. He now understood that every ounce of power that woman had wielded in this place had been a mask held together by fear and illusion. And now that mask had slipped. But Grace wasn't finished. She had sent a copy of the video to an independent journalist known for exposing the false facades of high society. There was no fanfare, no dramatic announcement, just an anonymous link quietly dropped in an inbox accompanied by a single line: "A lady of Charleston may not be quite the woman you think she is." A week later, the story appeared on a well-known blog. It named no one, yet its details were clear enough that anyone who had ever worked in Charleston's fine dining world knew exactly who it was about. Not Linda, the refined woman with a gaze sharp as glass and a voice smooth as venom, but Lisa Mayfield, the young woman once seen sobbing on a reality TV set, the one who had screamed that if she couldn't be famous, she'd rather disappear entirely. The article spread slowly but steadily, and over time the questions began to rise. Why had someone like that been granted so much reverence? How many people had stayed silent under mistreatment simply because they believed they had no voice? Grace never stepped forward to take credit. She gave no interviews, never boasted about what she had done. She carried on with her work as she always had, but now every step she took through the restaurant floor felt steadier. The fearful glances were gone, the pointless bows of submission gone too. The queen of Savannah Grill had fallen not to scandal, not to money, but to truth. And it was Grace who had dared to speak that truth when no one else would. Truth does not need to shout to be heard. It simply needs someone brave enough to stop whispering. She had built her throne by stepping on the backs of the powerless, but that throne had no roots. All it took was a breath of truth to bring it down, and the one who had summoned that breeze was the quiet girl who once carried water trays barely noticed in the hush of a new arrival. That very week, Mr. Whitmore quietly filed for divorce. There was no scandal, no media frenzy, no tabloid headlines, but in the refined circles of Charleston's elite, the news spread like wildfire. Some turned their backs, others chose silence. But everyone understood one thing clearly: Linda Whitmore was no longer the woman they had once feared. She disappeared from events, vanished from charity columns and red carpet appearances. The whispers changed their tone. Where once there had been fear, now there was pity, or worse, forgetfulness. Grace's rise had never been a rebellion. It was a quiet, steadfast resistance, a voice that didn't need to shout, only to stand firm. And in doing so, she had accomplished what no one had dared attempt for over a decade: unseat a false queen from a throne built not on respect but on fear. The day Linda walked out of Savannah Grill, no one stopped her and no one saw her off. The doors were open for her to leave, but none opened again behind her. The shadow of power she had once cast across the wooden floor had vanished, and behind that disappearance was the calm gaze of Grace, the woman who had reminded everyone that no reign lasts forever, especially not one built on deception. When the doors of Savannah Grill closed behind Linda Whitmore, something unseen left with her. No one said it aloud, but everyone in the room could feel it. A quiet relief, as if a long, punishing storm had passed, leaving behind a sky so clear it took them a moment to recognize it. The air felt different, lighter, easier to breathe, and peaceful in a way that this place hadn't known in a long time. There were no more cautious glances, no more hushed steps, no more suffocating tension each time the clock struck 8. Linda was gone. And like a curse lifted, the weight of everything she had imposed seemed to dissolve with her. Mr. Peaton was the first to break the silence. He stepped out from the kitchen, still holding a dish towel, and glanced slowly around the restaurant. Then he nodded, as if confirming to himself that what had just happened was real. Grace was standing behind the drink station when she saw Eddie, the seasoned bartender, make his way toward her. His eyes held emotion he didn't bother to hide. In more than 20 years working in this place, he had watched Linda break more people than he could count. But never had he seen anyone do what Grace had just done. Eddie said nothing. He simply gave her a quiet nod and placed a steady hand on her shoulder in silent recognition. A moment later, from the back of the kitchen, a soft sound broke the stillness. Applause. Just one pair of hands at first, then another, then a third. It grew slowly, steadily, without hurry but with weight. The sound filled the room not with noise but with meaning. It came from the servers who had once been humiliated, the cooks who had once stayed silent out of fear. They were standing tall now, clapping for something they had once believed impossible. Grace stood still, her eyes tinged red with emotion. She wasn't used to attention, even less to being seen as a hero. But in that moment, she understood that this wasn't just her story anymore. It was the story of everyone who had ever bowed their head out of fear, of everyone who had ever been silenced by power and pretense, and now they were free. That evening, for the first time in years, Savannah Grill became what it was always meant to be, a restaurant. The soft hum of laughter returned, the clink of glasses and cutlery no longer carried the undercurrent of dread. The servers moved with steady, confident strides instead of tiptoeing like shadows. Customers spoke with ease, unbothered by the fear of a single sharp glance from table number 9. Even Mr. Peaton exhaled deeply and visibly, as if finally shedding a burden he had carried for more than a decade. That night, after the last customer had gone and the doors were locked, the staff lingered for a few quiet minutes. No speeches, just a bottle of leftover wine opened without fanfare, a few pastries brought out from the kitchen. They raised their glasses to something small, yet deeply meaningful peace. And they all knew who had made that peace possible: Grace, the new girl who had arrived less than 6 months ago and somehow changed the soul of the place forever. Grace didn't feel like a hero. She had only done what she believed was right. But the truth was in the hearts of everyone at Savannah Grill. She was no longer just a waitress. She had become a symbol of courage, the first person to stare into the eyes of darkness and not blink. And when Linda walked out in silence, Grace hadn't just sent away a proud woman. She had ended a reign built on fear. One person brave enough to speak the truth can change the air in a room, can shift the very spirit of a place. And Grace had done exactly that. No shouting, no threats, just a single truth spoken at the right moment. And in that moment, the spell was broken. The applause that followed was proof. The soft, relieved smiles were proof. And the respectful glances from people who had once looked down in fear, now meeting her eyes with pride, were proof. Truth had won, and they all knew there would never be another Linda Whitmore walking through those doors again. 3 days after the night Linda Whitmore left Savannah Grill, rain came to Charleston. Not the kind that crashes down in heavy sheets, but a gentle, steady drizzle that felt more like the city was whispering something to those patient enough to listen. Grace sat alone in her small third-floor apartment, her uniform shirt draped over the back of a chair, her work shoes resting near the door. She was folding a note left by Eddie the night before. It said only 3 words. "You did it." She smiled, the kind of smile that is more breath than sound. Grace had never imagined she'd be the one to change anything. She had only ever tried to do what was right, but doing what's right is not always easy. When the phone rang, she didn't think much of it. She was steeping a cup of tea, her hands still damp from washing dishes. She wiped them hastily on her shirt and picked up the call. A man's voice came through, low and courteous. "Excuse me, is this Grace Collins?" "Yes, I'm Grace. Who's speaking?" "My name is David Chun. I don't expect you to know me, but I was at Savannah Grill that night, the night you, to put it plainly," silenced Linda Whitmore, perhaps for the first time in her life. Grace froze for a moment. She hadn't expected to hear that name again so soon. She suddenly remembered the man sitting near the bar that evening, dressed in a charcoal suit, quiet but watchful. David continued, his voice unhurried. "I'm not calling to praise you or congratulate you. I'm calling because I have a proposal." Grace sat down, still holding the phone. David explained that he was the founder of a private investigation firm operating in several major cities. They didn't deal with dramatic crimes like those on television. Their work was subtle, delicate, often involving discrete information gathering, analysis, and problem-solving in high-stakes situations. He told her he had watched the way she kept her composure, the way she faced Linda without flinching, and more than that, the way she quietly unearthed a past someone had tried hard to erase. That wasn't the behavior of an ordinary waitress, he said. That was instinct, the instinct of an investigator. Grace said nothing. She hadn't realized anyone had been paying that close attention. But David had noticed everything, and he valued it. "You don't have formal experience," he said. "But you have something more important. You have the ability to see the truth when others only see the surface." He invited her to his office in Atlanta for a paid one-week trial. There she would be trained, allowed to shadow real cases, and if she proved a good fit, she would be offered a permanent position. Grace listened to every word, still unable to fully believe what she was hearing. Just a week ago, she had been wondering whether she could even make it through the month on her waitress wages, and now someone was offering her the kind of work she used to dream about back in her journalism school days. When David paused, waiting for her response, Grace asked only one question. "Why me?" David let out a quiet laugh on the other end of the line. "Because you dared to look straight into the eyes of someone who made everyone else bow their heads, and you didn't blink. You can't teach that. You already have it." After the call, Grace sat in silence for a long while. The tea had gone cold. The rain continued falling steady and soft, but inside her, something had been washed clean. She had never waited to be rescued, never expected a miracle. But perhaps this was one not from some distant place, but born from her own refusal to turn away from what was right. Before going to bed that night, she called Eddie. He answered on the first ring. Grace told him about the call, about the offer. Eddie didn't sound surprised. "I knew someone would notice," he said. "They just needed time to look a little closer." When she hung up, she felt something she hadn't in many long months: hope. Not the fragile kind that comes from sending out job applications and waiting, but a real steady kind. A door had opened, and this time she would walk through it without hesitation. The call from David Chun didn't just open a new chapter for Grace Collins. It quietly closed an old one, a chapter written in hardship, endurance, and too many swallowed words. Her story wasn't simply about a young woman moving from a shuttered newsroom to a dining floor where the powerful came to be seen and obeyed. It was something deeper. A reminder of what perhaps all of us need to hear again from time to time, that courage doesn't require applause, that kindness is never a weakness, and that truth, no matter how long it is buried, always finds a way to be heard. In a world where the voices of the wealthy, the famous, and the powerful are too easily amplified, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand firm, to not back down, and everything begins to change. Linda Whitmore wasn't defeated by force or vengeance. She was undone by the very thing she feared most, her own truth. A past she tried to erase, deny, and bury beneath a toxic mask she used to intimidate others. But every mask eventually cracks, and truth never sleeps. Grace had no wealth, no status, no powerful allies to shield her. What she had was quiet resolve, a compassionate heart, and a pair of eyes sharp enough to see what so many had chosen to ignore. She didn't stand up to Linda out of vengeance. She did it simply because she could no longer bear to watch people like Eddie or Daniel live in fear each time the restaurant doors swung open. In a world where silence is often the safer choice, Grace chose to speak. And in doing so, she became a quiet force of change that reminded all of us, those who have ever felt too small to make a difference, that we are more powerful than we believe. Perhaps you're watching this video from a small room or on your way home after a long and weary day. Maybe you too have met a Linda in your life, someone who used their position to bully, to control, or to make you feel invisible. But please remember this: you carry more strength than you realize. And sometimes all it takes is one kind action, one brave sentence, or one moment of refusing to bow to what is wrong. And you can set off a ripple of change more powerful than you ever imagined. We hope today's story has left you with something worth thinking about. But now we'd love to hear from you. What did Grace's story stir in you? Has there been a moment when you witnessed injustice and didn't know what to do? Or perhaps were you the one who once stood up for what was right even when it was hard? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to listen from the deepest part of our hearts. Your words won't just help us understand you better, they might also become a small spark of hope for someone else who needs to hear them. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Echoes for more videos that speak to the heart. Please like, share, and help us bring these quiet, powerful stories to more people who may need them. A single share from you could help someone find themselves in a story like this one. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, a peaceful soul, and a life filled with love. Until next time, from all of us at Emotional Echoes, take care, and may your day be filled with calm and kindness.